person to be talking to about this because I think you have a pretty broad and comprehensive view of content that is a little bit different to how um, some others in the industry see it. So I'm really glad to talk to you about this. And just for context, because this episode has come about in a slightly unusual way. Because usually what happens is I want to talk to someone about a particular thing that they're doing or something that's popped up that I find interesting, and then I contact them and have a chat. But I made a post on LinkedIn that got a little bit of a response from a range of people. And one of the comments you made in that post was, I disagree with your take slightly. Let's have a chat about it. And so I
Mhm.
think that's a great reason to have a podcast. So I want to just explain a little bit of my view of what I was writing in that post. And I'll link to the post in the show notes so people can get that context and read it for themselves. But I basically made that post because I have been speaking generally to hiring managers, and I do that all the time anyway, hiring managers and listening to people as well who are applying for jobs. And what I have heard generally is that for content designers who are attempting to move into, say, intermediate or senior roles, there is a lack of product related skill that they need in order to advance. And in particular, what these people are saying to me, and also what I'm seeing in terms of people who submit their portfolios for review at UXCC and so on,
Yeah.
is there's a very insular and isolated view that they have, which is I'm working on these individual screens, and they think that the goal of whatever they're working on is to write the copy. What they struggle with is connecting what they are working on to a broader product ecosystem. So not just in terms of the connecting what they're doing to the overall organizational goal of increase market share or whatever the organizational goal is, but also there is a lack of rigor and the ability to connect what they are doing to support different systems within the product. And I think that, and some of this comes down to content strategy, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But I what my post was really reflecting on was the idea that content sits to me as a way to support other elements of a product ecosystem. And in order to really make an organizational wide impact, content designers need to understand how their products are structured and work, which means you need to understand what the tech stack looks like. You need to understand the different features of the product that you're not necessarily working on. And that was what my post was really speaking to. And the hiring managers who I've spoken to have been saying they get people who, especially after the hiring rush during COVID, they get people who can write great UX content, so they can write copy for a user interface. They understand what it means to write a great notification. They understand what it means to write a great onboarding flow, but they don't necessarily understand how to think about how their feature that they're working on relates to other features within the organization. And they don't necessarily have a view that allows them to move to that next step, which is, say, creating a design system or thinking much more broadly. So that's what my post was really, really getting towards. Now, you made a comment on that post that was something along the lines of, you felt that that view, or at least what I had written, was maybe a little bit upside down. So I'd be interested to hear your take on that and where you come to this from.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciated the post, and I also appreciate you having me on because I'm only snarky in your comments, Patrick, because I know you can take it. Not everyone,
Oh no,
not
no,
everyone plays along
no,
on
I get it.
LinkedIn, and it's like we have to be so serious here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to talk about that. I think there's a couple of interesting things in what you said. I mean, if there, there's a hiring boom. I got laid off during COVID, but then I got a new opportunity during COVID. I started working at MailChimp. I was talking to lots of other people at the time who are getting their first roles or getting onboarded into product and UX cultures. It's been a few years since COVID, so I'd be curious where the professional development support was for those folks. A lot of them that I've
Mm,
talked to didn't have managers who understood content or content people and weren't good at giving guidance and development to some of those junior folks to help them make those cases and articulate how they're part of the product experience. So, like, I know it's not a blame game, but I do just, it rankles a little to
mm,
hear that, because a lot of my business is professional development, training, in-house speaking, coaching,
yeah.
consulting for these kinds of folks. And it's been a rough few years, which is to
Mm,
say the money's not falling off the trees at let's help out my content people.
mm,
I got to do a
yeah.
workshop recently for a big financial services company. They had me do a portfolio workshop for their UX content people, 50 odd folks. They've never had any support before for their content portfolios, for their design portfolios, which means they have not had a lot of dedicated thought and work and attention on how do I articulate my contribution within the larger product ecosystem, which is exactly what you're talking about. So, what support have we been giving to people? Another thing that I would be curious about is the content experience of the hiring managers that you've been speaking to.
Hmm.
Because my experience on kind of the flip side of that, which is coaching job seekers and candidates and career transitioners who are trying to get those roles, and the people who are on the other side of the table from the hiring managers, the gap I see is usually not one of skills, and it's usually not one of clarity, intellect, systems thinking, or anything. It's an articulation gap.
Hmm.
It's how do I tell the story of what I do in language that you want to hear?
Mm,
And that's very different than you're not thinking about this the right way. You're not approaching it the right way. You're, whatever it might be. And I know you're not saying that, but if that's, kind of the vibe, the ambiance that you're getting from the hiring managers, that's something where, like, and absolutely, if someone does a poor job of articulating that and someone else does a great job, that person who does the great job of it has a much better chance of getting that job. That makes perfect sense to me. But I don't think that's the same thing as saying, like, oh, these people aren't thinking big enough, and the content people aren't thinking about product. So
mm,
that's all just on what you said, which I think is, like, it's a very interesting place to start. I don't think there's anything wrong. I think this is, in fact, something very good about, like, encouraging content people, like, hey, like, pull your head up from the writer's desk, look around as often as you can, see who these people are, ask them how they work, what they've been doing, start to build connections across the product with
mm.
your peers. Especially, a lot of these companies, they have content designers, but they don't have like a content design practice per se
Yeah.
or a content
Yeah.
strategy practice. So everyone feels like they're a content design team of one.
Mm,
So there's not oversight or culture around getting the content people to talk to each other, so they have to start it themselves. It's so terribly under resourced compared to how we treat designers, and God forbid how we treat engineers, where
mm.
the whole operation revolves around them. So I just want to lay that out. And I know you're on the side of content people because that's what you do all day long. And I want to just back you and be ever more on the side of content people, because I don't think people are setting us up for success all of the time in
Well,
these
I
systems.
think, yeah, I think what you're speaking to was something some others also said in the comments, and there were some really great comments about how a lot of the time this is not a problem, and it's the question of whose responsibility is it, right? Like, if you're coming into a new role in the past few years and you're entering this industry and you're doing the work, is it your responsibility to go out and learn this on your own, or is it the responsibility of the managers in place to really lift the bar, right? Or lift the
Yeah.
floor of the people who are working under you? So I do think that, yeah, the content practices have been under resourced. It is the responsibility of, I think, these same hiring managers to put training and effort into upskilling those people. So I definitely agree with that. The other thing I think I I I also agree with is, for some reason, and this is the eternal struggle, resources are given to developers, resources are given to marketing. Content, afterthought, you know? And what's even more frustrating to me is the fact that if there was ever going to be a time where it was proven that content didn't matter, it would be in the past couple of years since, the whole AI boom. Like, if it was ever going to happen, that would be it. That
Right,
hasn't
right.
happened. That hasn't happened. I just did our jobs newsletter today. Google and Netflix are hiring multiple content designers across multiple
Yeah.
teams. Meta is hiring a bunch of content designers in the UK. I'm not suggesting the hiring is like it was a few years ago when it was absolutely nuts. What I'm saying is that if it was so easy that, AI can do everything now, then I think 2 years is enough time to prove that out. And I don't think that has been proven.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, then the natural consequence of that is, okay, so if content design is important, where are the resources for it? So I definitely agree with that. I guess I just wish that um, sometimes I feel as though there is some antagonism within content, like it's us against the rest of the product. We're
Yeah.
and part of that's design in general, because you're focusing on user needs and the organization is sort of coming top down and you're coming bottom up. So I understand that sort of conflict. But I guess I just wish there was a little bit more curiosity about, you know, how does the technology within the product work? How does this feature interact with this feature? That team, what's that team's goals? Like, how can we help them? You know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
when you talk about sort of like the lifting your head up, I guess what I'm getting at is I wish there was just a little bit more of that, from what I'm seeing. And
Yeah.
yeah.
And some of it is, this is something I find broadly true in career coaching. I mean, irrespective of content or UX or anything, is like, there's two parts to it, which is the doing and the noticing. So
Yeah.
you might be curious about those things. You might be asking, you might be digging into it, but are you noticing that you are doing it? And then therefore later, are you able to tell a story about how you were doing it or how you made
Mm.
decisions based on doing that and paying attention to the product goals and the larger ecosystem and so on. So that's like totally valid. Um, Something that is the one of the first things I was going to say where like kind of the take of like the oversimplified framing of what you shared on LinkedIn, which is not what you're really saying, but like, I kind of was responding in the spirit of like, if someone's driving by and they see these two circles where like content is a small circle inside a product, which is a big circle, I'm like, very loud cartoon brake sound, as I'm kicking
Yeah.
my, Flintstone style and I'm rolling the cart backwards. Because and I know that that's not really it. So sometimes I do think like I think the us against them vibe I want to touch on first comes from a different philosophy, like a different kind of spirit, maybe underneath the disciplines. I say this with as much love and kindness as I can, but in 2024, at large, publicly traded capitalistic technology companies, user experience design is not inherently and necessarily following a user-centered design process. It is generally following, especially if there's product management, it's hewing to the product management scope, delivery, view of the world. Product management is management. It's a form of management, which is not about strategy and it's not about setting direction. It's about building the thing as efficiently as you can and getting it done. So if you are sitting in there and you're thinking like, well, my role and where I come from is like making stuff as understandable as possible for our users, making sure I'm not going to other users with my language, making sure that I'm going to make people feel included, make sure that I'm making things that support people who are neurodiverse, who may have trouble understanding something like this, or maybe are experiencing it in a stressful time in their lives. Find me the product management philosophy or handbook that is organized around that. There isn't one. There isn't one. So you're sitting in there thinking, they're like, this is what I care about and this is who I want to help. And it kind of doesn't seem like everyone else like really. I mean, I know they care. Like, it's not like, oh, the designers are evil and the product managers are only care about money. Like, some of the kindest, warmest, nicest, most loving people I know have been in those roles. But it's what we incentivize. What are we incentivizing?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if we're not incentivizing the kind of work that content people tend to do. So that's like, as big as that is, that's actually kind of a smaller problem. So some folks may have seen my content Death Star diagram, where I was sort of playing with your original and expanding it. And that's sort of like a light, fun version of the ecosystem apps I do for clients. It actually comes back to the most annoying conversation in our discipline. And I'm sorry to bring it up on your podcast, Patrick. But the conversation is, what is content? What is content? I've been doing more education later in my career. It's really fun. I get to teach a UX writing class at the School of Visual Arts in New York for interaction design students in an MFA program. They are not content design or content strategy people. They're not really UX design or product people. They kind of are off on their own thing. It's really exciting and fun. I teach content strategy privately through Content Career Accelerator and other programs. And so it's something I've had to articulate for people a lot. And the closer and closer I look and the more I look at it, I'm realizing a big part of the challenge is the words that are part of the interface are fundamentally not content. They are part of the interface. That's why we have this spirit of, Michael Metz and Andy Welfley told us that writing is designing through the title of their book and their work. It is. Those are their words, and like in a casual, colloquial way, like, do you have the content for this screen or this flow? That's fine. I'm not like trying to critique how anyone talks about it. But the larger definition that I found the most useful, and one that you will find in, for instance, Apple's human interface guidelines, like Google's design system, like Jared Spool's definition, one of the UX thought leaders of all time, content is what people are there for. The content is what people are there for. It's not the stuff that helps them get to the thing that they are there for. And so the thing that they are there for might be a need, a service, a transaction, something related to their business. It's not all necessarily living within the product. And there's a significantly larger content ecosystem around the product. Because we have interface content and copy. We have what I think of as product content, so stuff that's like really part of it. Like I've been getting back into music production, so built into the Logic on Apple's Logic Pro, there's all these tooltips and guides and stuff. It's not like interactive content, but it's like helping me use it. So there's content inside the product. There's also a whole lot of content outside of the product that a product manager doesn't know about, is not in their purview. They're not thinking about. No one is tasking them with making sure the content about their product is staying up to date. And that's the curiosity that I see and that I wish we rewarded more from people on these product design teams, is they're kind of putting their hand up and saying like, well, what about all the content downstream of this that's about the thing that we're designing that we just changed? Have we talked to those people? What's the lift going to be like for them to update all the documentation around this? What's the lift going to be like for our product marketing team and their content managers to update all of the screenshots and flows and descriptions on just the landing pages about these features?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm sure they're out there. I haven't met the product managers. I haven't worked for one, at least, that is like asking those questions proactively. So content people have a different orientation. Diverse teams are good. Yes, definitely in the DEI way, which I don't have expertise in, so I'm not going to speak to, but also in the like diversity of mindsets. Like if everyone in there is a quote unquote product thinker, you're getting smaller, not bigger.
Yeah. Okay. Lot to respond to there. So I'll start with the last thing you said. I absolutely agree with that. Like the diversity of opinion. You don't want everyone coming to the design process or the product process with the same thinking of everyone who's gone through a product management course. You don't want that, right? And you certainly don't want to lose. I mentioned sort of like the bottom up from users, top down approach of an organization. You want that, for lack of a better word, conflict. You want that. Um, I Regarding the question about what people are coming to the product for. Um, well, first of all, you mentioned that there is this larger content ecosystem. I 100% agree with that. And not to do a nasty plug, but we're about to launch this course about help and support content. And one of the things we talk a lot about in that course is the fact that most help and support content sits outside of the user interface. And so there needs to be much more communication about how this is updated and what's the process for doing that, and the
Yeah,
ecosystem
yeah.
and so on. So I completely agree with you that the ecosystem is bigger. I think I brush up against what you said about what are people coming to the product for. So if correct me if I'm wrong, but your thought here is that they are coming to the product for the content. um
I think
it,
it's, I mean,
could you
that
describe that a little bit more?
yeah, I mean, that turns it into a tautology, and it is a little bit, but it's not that they're coming there for the content. I think that's the wrong mindset of like, people are
Hmm.
coming here for the words, and people are coming here for the documents and the videos and the great things that we made. It's more that the thing that they are there for, whatever that thing is to the user in an interaction design sense, the content.
Hmm.
There's the interface, which is the part of the product that most of us on product design teams spend most of the time looking at, that facilitates the access, use, enablement, whatever, of the thing that the person wants to do.
Got it.
So if I'm using a banking app, my account balance, from my perspective, if I'm like, can I afford this new guitar? And I go in there, the content that I need is my balance.
Right.
I don't think product people tend to think of like the balance as content. I don't think content people tend to think of the balance as content, but it is what the
Mm.
user is there for. And if
Yep.
you use that as a lens, you start to realize that there are things that facilitate access to the thing. And the creation of that stuff is very much interaction design, user experience design. A lot of it involves words. A lot of it involves words. And we need people who are very good with words to do that. You could have a words only interaction with a SaaS app that has really good accessibility because you're not looking at any screens. You're using a screen reader, voice assistant, someone is using it on your behalf, whatever. So you could have an entirely words based interaction with something, but like the words on the buttons and whatever else it is that helps you get there is still not the content. Just because
Mm.
it's words doesn't make it content. It's stuff people are there for. And the stuff that people are there for could be all kinds of things depending on what the business does. But there's also a lot of content that is more like, my other definition, right, is like content is the stuff that we choose to manage like content. And so that there's words that support the product supports the business, and the content supports the business. And there's a lot more content outside of and around the product generally than there is like quote unquote content that we need to do content designy things with inside of the product. Um, and so I think there's a friction of philosophies or schools of thought, maybe, where if you're approaching your work more as a content strategist or someone who's trying to think systematically and holistically about content, and I think this is why your post was interesting to me. Like if we want to encourage systems thinking and bigger picture thinking and content people, or let's call them writers now, product writers,
Hmm.
to me that doesn't lead to like being more curious about the product briefs or whatever. It's like, okay, how does my work ladder up to this massive, massive ecosystem of content that is in 2024 for a lot of businesses is the entire business,
Hmm.
because we don't have factories and we don't have offices. We just have this stuff.
Hmm.
That's much bigger than what we quote unquote call the product.
Yeah. Well, I think So it was interesting to hear you explain this idea about what people are there for, because I think if you and I know I've seen you write about this before, and I think when I initially saw your take on this, my my interpretation of that, you know, a false interpretation of that was um, equating the goal of the user with what they're there for. So you're not saying that the goal of the user is the content. Their goal is to accomplish a task, but the way they do that is through content. So to hear you articulate that, I think I'm right on that.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah. So like,
yeah?
yeah, a way of to just really quick, like so I started writing interface copy for mobile apps. I was right there at the beginning of the app store boom. And that's where I cut my teeth. I was working for this startup. We were all young. We did not know what we were doing. I was the word person who didn't know what I was doing. And so like I didn't know where to turn. And I like my Bible at the time was Apple's iOS human interface guidelines,
Yep.
and something that they emphasize over and over. And some of this is semantics, yes. But like just advice they would give to a designer is minimize distractions, minimize the interface so that you can present as much content as possible and like put the content forward. So if that's a game, ideally you would go interfaceless when the game is playing because the game is the content and it should fill up the whole screen. If you are a reading app, some kind of ebook reader thing, similarly, like the interface, if it's podcasts, podcatchers, right? Like you want to get all of that interfacey stuff out of the way as much as possible to provide access to the content. And that if content is my bank account balance or whatever it is. So that's sort of like the distinction they're drawing of like, yeah, the thing you're there to do, play, learn, experiment with, etc. A lot of what product people focus on correctly is like value and value delivery. That stuff is esoteric too. Like that's not like literally built into the product. It's like a benefit of the use of the product. We're not directing, there's not a path to the value. It just is like a benefit, a thing you get from using it. So yeah, so that's the way I'm starting to use. I strayed and I'm coming back to talking about content that way again. If it's the thing that people are there for, and the rest of it is the interface, which helps them get to and use and understand the thing that they're there for. And if there happen to be words in that interface side of it, that doesn't make it content. It probably doesn't mean that we want to manage it like content. We want to manage it like design. We want product people working on that. We want UX writers and content designers working on that 100%. That's different. That's different stuff than the content itself. And certainly the larger ecosystem. I don't know any product people who are helping with the employment content for their company, but that's pretty important content too.
Yeah.
That's so what, how do we get content designers working on that? Well, if they're inside of product teams, the answer is you don't.
You don't generally. Yeah.
Yeah. Or the HR content or whatever it might be.
Yeah. I think the most common one you get is probably content designers working on help and support content, to bring that up again, because I know, for instance, or product marketing. Yeah. I know, for instance, at Meta, a lot of content designers who are working on user interface stuff will end up writing help and support content. At least the ones that I've spoken to have done that. I don't know if that's true of everyone in those teams. But that's kind of a sort of more holistic way of looking at it. I want to go back to something you said before, though, which is your view that forgive me if I've misinterpreting this or articulating it incorrectly, but I think you said that some more curiosity among content people about how products work or product thinking won't necessarily lead to better outcomes. Is that kind of a fair
I think in a way,
summary?
I don't know if I was expressing that directly, but I wouldn't. I don't take umbrage with you, taking that from what I said. I'm going a million miles an hour. I don't always know what I said.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I think what I brush up against is and I think, whenever you make a LinkedIn post like that, there's a lot of context that like is left unsaid, before and when you're articulating things. I think what sort of sets me off a little bit is when people sort of act like, oh, that's the development part. I don't care about that. I just do content.
Mhm.
And it's the same in reverse, right? Like a lot. I've worked with a lot of developers who are just like, oh, that's just the content. That's not the product. You know what I mean? And so there's this sort of piecemeal approach to it that I just don't like. But what I think can hold some content folks back, and this gets into the whole discussion about like getting a seat at the table, sort of thing. Um, my my problem that I have is we get a lot of talk about, getting into product discussions very early. Content people should be there. We should be
Mhm.
helping guide the design, which I 100% agree with. My issue is if you go, there's a moth in my face. If you get to that table and you don't know how to have discussions with product managers about how products work, or heads of development about the technical aspects of the product, um, then you may as well not be there in the first place. Now you can contribute, but I just think that but I think there's a ceiling to your development if there is a lack of rigor there. And again, we go back to the idea that it's not just your responsibility; it's the responsibility of hiring managers and organizations, for that matter, to invest in their people. Candy Williams made a great comment on my post about how it's it's not that content people don't understand this, it's that a lot of the time they're not being trained in the right way. It's not like content
Yeah.
designers are inherently like can't do product. It's just that I think that this is an area that, to your point, has been um under it hasn't been given the attention it deserves. And I think for content designers there's a need perhaps um to do so of their own volition, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would agree with you. And I think this is one of those situations where like there are two things that seem like they're in conflict, but I think they can both be true.
Sure.
So that kind of curiosity that you're talking about, and certainly like um I'm going to assume here's where I want to come at this from. I'm
Mhm.
assuming the curiosity is 100% there. Maybe it's
Mhm.
200% there. I know this because for all that people may or may not think of me as some sort of successful person in this field, I have been on product teams and felt that way of like, Jesus, I really wish I like understood how this worked better. And like I went and
Yeah.
had a meeting with the BA and they showed me a whole bunch of charts and pie graphs and I left feeling more confused than I went into the meeting. It sucks. It's not a good feeling. I did not like when a certain company I worked for got acquired by another big, large company, and their product people were even more producty. And now in these meetings, they're throwing out acronyms that I am like actively having to Google during the meeting. That's a bad feeling. That's a bad feeling when you're like 13 years into your career and have your book out already, and everybody thinks you're an expert on everything. I'm not. Never said I was. So that's not comfortable. The curiosity is there. It's
Yep.
100% there. The comfort, no. The comfort is hard to come by. It's
Yeah.
hard to come by. And I think it's harder to come by. And I definitely don't want to talk about this, but because it's been belabored at so many conferences. But like, you know, if you're coming from a place of imposter syndrome or feeling like you're not supposed to be at the party anyway, or feeling like some of the people are like, why are they at the party?
Mm.
It's hard to ask innocent questions, what we sometimes call dumb questions. Like it's
Yeah.
hard to find that comfort. I know people are looking for it because and I'm sure you see this as well, in my various intake forms and applications and all the stuff around Content Career Accelerator, it is far and away the top concern. Comfort with product, being able to talk about my work
Mm.
in a product context, contextualizing my past experience in terms that UX and product people will understand. It may be that I talk to an inordinate amount of career transitioners. I kind of attract like the people who, like me, are similarly having midlife crises and trying to figure out what they want to be when they grow up a second time. That's a top concern. So people want it. But you're right. It's hard. Where's the training? How do we get people at that comfort level? So yes, that is 100% true. So you are right in that caring more about that, learning more about that, I think will lead to better individual outcomes
Mm.
for that person in their career. I do not necessarily think putting your curiosity there versus the other many salient questions about content that you could care about in a business, I don't think I think those are more fruitful and could have better outcomes for the business.
I definitely
The
agree with that.
right.
Yep.
Like we keep talking about the product, the impact on the product, the product is part of the business. A lot of times there's like 50 product teams at the business. So it's not just
Yep.
the product, it's the company that we all work for.
Yep.
How are we helping them?
Yep. I see, and this goes back to what you were saying earlier about a lot of these problems are articulation problems, right? To me, I'm coming at this from and I guess because of where I sit, running UXCC, and so I'm always thinking about how to help individuals all the time, and so that's where I'm coming from this from.
Yeah, yeah.
But I agree with you that it will not necessarily lead to better outcomes for the business, and that the flip side of this is I have talked to a shocking number of product managers who don't think of user interface content, and I say user interface content and not content overall, because
Mhm.
the content designers are the ones they're usually interacting with the most. They don't consider that as part of the process still.
Which is wild,
um
right? Like that is just
yeah,
patently wild and regressive. Like
yeah,
let
I
just
just
be
don't I just don't
come
understand it.
on.
And I mean, I've spoken to content designers at Apple who say this, who and
Yeah.
you would think of any company that the 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 user interface content there would be respected as part of the design. And now look, Apple is a famously segmented company, and so different
Sure.
teams have different approaches, so I can't speak to everyone there. But it is just wild to me that you have product managers who still don't think about content that way.
Yeah.
And I'm
Well,
glad you
where
brought
the
up the
yeah,
Death Star thing, because it is so much bigger than user interface content. And I mean, I really really do feel like, and maybe I'll write something about this one day, but like it's and this is sort of content strategy, what content strategy should be, right? Looking after the chief content officer, I guess you might even want to call them. That is what needs to be emphasized. But yeah, it's still just amazing to
yeah,
me. I just can't get
yeah.
over it.
And the strange analogy that just leapt to mind for me is urban planning and especially like transportation design. Like here in the United States, it's hard for a lot of people to imagine a world without cars, without owning a vehicle and having your own personal transportation. Even people who live in big cities and have to like scramble for parking every day in their lives can't imagine it. And I feel like, and I say this with love because everyone is doing their best and they're going to work for what they're incentivized to work for. But I feel like I've had so much as had product managers tell me, like, hey, like I've got to support my people. I got to have their back. I got these numbers I'm trying to hit. We've been given these kind of marching orders where everyone needs to be showing how they're contributing to this like larger milestone or big, hairy, audacious goal or whatever it is. And so that's what I need to be able to articulate. And so, okay, how can I do that? How can I do that? Well, so let's say the goal that all of these different product managers have is like move people as efficiently as possible through our city, through my part of the city, right? So everyone's going to be focused, like that's what they're looking at. How do I move people as efficiently as possible through my part of the city? Well, if you have 10 or 15 or 20 people in 15 or 20 different parts of the city, all focusing on how do I move people faster through my part of the city, that's not necessarily going to do anything to alleviate traffic or help
Hmm.
human beings move across the city more efficiently. And that's what I kind of see sometimes of like, why aren't you more curious about what we're trying to accomplish in the product goals? I think there's a massive, I'll frame it positively. That's the feedback I always get. Scott, why are you always so negative? So I will frame it positively. There is a massive effing opportunity available to any product manager who wants to pick it up and run with it, which is to start thinking about your content ecosystem and
Hmm.
look at how were people moving through the city before they got here? where are they trying to get to after they're here? Because you probably don't own the whole thing. Unless you are like the director of product, you've got your own little area. Maybe doing things with support content can help you meet your goals. Maybe doing things with the marketing content can help you meet your goals. Maybe doing things with social media content, user-generated content, focusing on what's on Wikipedia or going into LLMs, those things might be able to help you meet your goals. But we don't get that. We're going to try out 30 different colors of cornflower blue for the button. We're going to A/B test the CTA on all of these things. It's dim. It's kind of dim and kind of small. And it's weird to me that I guess where I kind of like the larger umbrage that I do take is like, I'm just kind of always sitting in there where it's like in these meetings of, oh, well, Scott's concerned about this and Scott's concerned about that. And like, we really need people to be focusing on the product and the business. And it's like, buddy, I am. I kind of feel like maybe you're not, because this thinking feels a little small and the vest feels a little tight. And I don't know how we're supposed to make a big impact if we're not actually being systems thinkers.
Well, I don't know if I should say this on the podcast, but like
you can always cut it out.
No. It's not controversial, but I've always been interested in creating, some type of software product. And lately I've been thinking about the help and support content stuff. Really got me thinking about, we have a lot of software that's come out about, managing the strings in a user interface. And then you have a separate CMS for support content. And then you have a separate CMS for marketing content. I've thought very hard about creating a product that manages everything and anything together in one massive platform that integrates with everything.
And those systems are probably working with different taxonomies, right? Or like individually developed, separately managed taxonomies, even though they're all part of the same ontology, or should be. So it's like, yeah, absolutely.
I think one thing that also really frustrates me, to frame things negatively, is when that piece of feedback. Yeah, as much as I wrote in my LinkedIn post about how content designers individually need to think more about product, and I also think that comes from a place of like managing my own business for the past few years, where you just naturally sort of get into that sort of framework. So I do agree with you that it's an individual outcome more than an organizational outcome, perhaps. But when people say to you, oh, you need to think more about the business and you need to think more about the product thinking and so on, there's also a question of like, well, not everyone's a product manager, right? There's a reason product managers exist. There's a reason BAs exist, and so on. And I do fear sometimes that my advice over indexes on people who want to become leads or something. So
that's interesting.
There is absolutely nothing wrong with like not necessarily knowing what you need to know and know more, right? Like you don't necessarily need to know like every single aspect of the tech stack or whatever. And maybe it's just because the way I'm wired, I just want to know everything. But then you get into situations like you described where you talk to someone and you're like, well, now I have 1,000 more questions. You have to stop at some point. You can't possibly know everything, because that's why companies have a CEO, right? Because that's their job to sort of look over everything. You kind of need to focus. I don't know what I'm saying, but I agree with you.
I feel like with the fundamental question, kind of posed of like, what's the benefit, or should content people be learning more about product? I feel like I kind of gave you my yes, but answer of like, sort of, but I also like see this other stuff. I'll give you a yes and answer, which is like, yes. And what I'm often coaching content people on, and I would really like to see a lot more of, is for content people, wherever they're looking, if they're looking at the product level, if they're trying to look more at the organizational level, I think we could learn a lot, somewhat ironically, from how UX and product people tend to communicate with each other and to executives and to business leaders. I know that the UX and product designers that I've been able to observe who have a lot of success in their careers, and also just success in the sense of like being recognized for their accomplishments and people telling them they did a good job, and just the vibe that their star is rising, they are good designers and they're just as good of a designer as the other designers that I know, but they're really, really good at talking about how they're a good designer. And they're
Mm.
really good at putting presentations together. And they put a lot of presentations together and they put them together quickly and they get something ready for every single meeting. Um, I may be speaking to past me who just like kind of didn't like doing that stuff. I'm like, can you guys just intuit from what I'm saying that I'm right and this is a better course of action? Like, come
Yeah.
on, that's not
Yeah.
very effective. Don't be like me. Be like people that I knew, like Sarah from Mailchimp, who would just like crush at creating digestible information that made sense to product managers, that made sense to executives, that helped people align and coordinate. That is something that helps you have things for your portfolio. It helps you think in a portfolio, like always building my portfolio mindset.
Mm.
It creates artifacts to point to. Like if you're worried that people aren't understanding your impact, like start telling more stories about your impact and documenting them, and asking for 5 minutes on the agenda. That's a space where you can ask for a seat at the table, is like everyone's sharing their work from this quarter or from this last month, or whatever it might be at the all hands. Like, cool, can I get 5 minutes to talk about this thing that I did on this project?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd be very surprised if someone says absolutely not, we don't want to hear
Absolutely
about
not. But also, you can just email people. You can just email an entire product team and just be like, "Hey, just letting everyone know, we did this in the content, and
it.
it had this effect." But I agree with you. Like, it's funny to me watching people, and I've done. This is a learned skill. Obviously, it's not inherent to anyone. I remember when I would speak to the head of a department who's like, 3 steps ahead of me or whatever, and they would ask a question. I would be sort of like very in the weeds about, what we're doing. So we're doing this and we're doing this. And you could just sort of see their eyes like glaze over, where they're just kind of like, just give me the gist. You
Mhm.
know what I mean? Just give me the gist. And I think learning how to talk to people at their level, and I don't mean in terms of skill, I mean in terms of seniority and what they care about, is
Yeah.
is such an important skill. Just things like, we want to front load information, and we do that all the time in a user interface, but we don't do it in our own
Right.
presentations.
Yeah. And I think that is, I've been guilty of this so many times. I see it. And when I go back and revisit my old talks and writings and things where I'm like, why did this, like, I don't even like this now. And now I can see why
Mm,
it didn't take off, because there wasn't that front loading. There wasn't the so what up front.
mm,
It was like, I'm sitting down in my big comfy chair and opening the book and getting ready to read to all the children. And so I'm going into like storyteller mode, which can be a really nice mode to be in as a designer sometimes, but not in those kinds of meetings, not in
no.
stand-ups, not in the executive communications. Like, you got to
Yeah.
think hard like a content designer, lean on your skills there, give people the TLDR right up front, articulate a clear ask, request, we used to call them, articulate a clear request, and call to action from whatever you're presenting, so that something might actually happen.
Mm,
I'm just speaking to past me. It's like, well, when you break this stuff down with people on like an individual or coaching level, like I almost never have to tell anyone anything that they didn't know already.
yeah.
I just kind of have
Yeah.
to help them see it and be like, well, so tell me, why do you think this didn't go over, or why were you not invited to this meeting, or why did this not go very well? And then that person, more often than not, can tell me, can
Yeah.
just 100% tell me.
Yeah.
And it's hard. Maybe we don't. Maybe
Yeah.
if you're pulled in 5 directions and you're supporting 5 teams, like having the time and resources and privilege to work on that kind of stuff, that's not always easy. Sometimes
Yeah.
it feels like you're just doing what you can to keep your job, and it's hard to thrive. That's a different conversation, though.
Yeah.
If you want to know why it's not working, that's could be why it's not working.
As we start to wrap up, because we've been talking for nearly an hour, which is crazy. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on the industry at the minute? Because obviously it's been a tough couple of years. We were just speaking before we started recording about how things might be changing just a little bit. What are you seeing at the minute right now, and how do you feel about the industry in general?
structured content, structured content, structured content.
Yeah.
That's how I
Yeah.
feel. That's all I'm reading about. I love it. I feel like um I watched this Netflix show about like this prison experiment, not like the Stanford one, but they were like trying to give inmates more autonomy. And I learned the term
Okay.
old heads, which is like
Oh yeah.
the folks that have been in there for a while. So I love that. So I feel like the content old heads are getting to pipe back up again and say, we've been saying this all along, friends. Like you
Yep.
need to have a structured content environment. And I, ironically, I only read a AI transcript of summary of a conversation that Karen McGrain had recently with Jorge Arango because I didn't have time to listen to his podcast today. But what I gleaned from the Gen AI summary is that, a point that Karen made that I really loved is that, you know, like we've been saying this all along, and we're coming to this point now where like it's more salient than ever. And Erica Hall might have been writing about this on LinkedIn as well, that like all these organizations pivoted so hard into SEO and like organizing their whole content footprint around the natural way that everyone looks for information today. And now, which was search, and now it's not. Now it's something else, which is Gen AI. And like even Google is like not prioritizing search. They're prioritizing their Gen AI answers and summaries at the top. So like content design is going to continue to be important because we need interfaces to be good, and interfaces are mostly made of words. And if they're not made of words, they're still conversational. So content design forever, friends. And we need a lot more people talking about structured content. I think there's a big market for individuals to start doing that. If you're not getting headway, dear listener, with product people understanding you, go start talking more to the developers. Talk to whoever sets up and manages the content management system. Go talk to the marketing and brand people, because they are all going in and trying to figure this stuff out right now. How do we thrive? How do we stay relevant? How do we keep our brand in the conversation with this stuff? So I think to me, that just feels like the whole thing now. I think the jobs are going to be talking about it. I think the conferences are going to be talking about it. I think the craft skill of writing good interface copy, I think this is a point you were making on LinkedIn as well, like always important. That's always going to be important, but there's bigger, higher order levels of thinking. For me, it's not thinking like a product manager. For me, it's thinking more like an information architect, like a content manager, a content operations specialist, those sorts of things. Those are the people that's where the opportunities are going to be anyway.
Yep. I think I agree. Scott, I always love talking to you. Where can people find you?
Yeah, likewise, man. I'm easy to find. I'm online at kubie.co, kubie.co. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. Yeah, that's the whole deal.
Awesome. Thanks again, man. This has been great.
Yeah, Patrick, thanks for having me on. Always a pleasure.